Thank you for joining us today for the Southern Legislative Conference webinar entitled Innovations in Water Treatment and Conservation. I'm Ann Roberts, Policy Analyst for the Southern Legislative Conference, the Southern Office of the Council of State Governments in Atlanta, Georgia. I'd like to thank our distinguished panelists for setting aside time from their very busy schedules to be here with us and for enlightening us on state efforts in water treatment and conservation. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping items. You are all in listen-only mode. If you wish to ask a question, please use the question box on your GoToWebinar toolbar. You may type in a question at any time during the webinar, and we will get to them at the end. We will be recording this webinar and posting it on the CSG Knowledge Center website, knowledgecenter.csg.org, and on the SLC website, slcatlanta.org. Finally, please understand that the views expressed in this webinar are not necessarily the views shared or expressed by SLC. Rather, they are intended to serve as a platform for discussion. In much of the United States, water has been the key in determining historic settlement patterns and development opportunities. Almost every major U.S. city is located near a major river or body of water. Abundant water for drinking, sanitation, industry, irrigation, transportation, and recreation has been a hallmark of much of the South. However, development pressure, changes in precipitation patterns, transitioning priorities, and consumption levels have caused a shift in this situation. Water resource scarcity can affect many sectors of the economy as well as the region's natural ecosystems. Periodic droughts, overconsumption of water resources, and other factors can create water shortages. Managing these resources will likely become more challenging with projected precipitation pattern changes and anticipated population and economic growth. To offset or prevent water scarcity, many states in the Southern Legislative Conference have adapted creative solutions to water treatment and reuse. However, states must ensure that water quality standards and public health concerns are met. We're fortunate today to have an excellent panel to help us understand the status and causes of water scarcity in SLC states and address ways in which state legislators can promote innovation in water treatment while conserving valuable natural resources. Our first presenter is Dr. Ken Kunkel, research professor and senior scientist for the Cooperative Institute for Climate and Satellites at North Carolina State University and the National Climatic Data Center. Dr. Kunkel's recent research has focused on climate variability and change, particularly related to extreme events such as heavy precipitation, heat waves, cold waves, and winter storms. A particular focus has been the historical variations in the frequency and intensity of such extreme events, extending from the late 19th century to the present. As part of his involvement in the National Climate Assessment, he led the development of a 9-part National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration technical report series published in 2013 to support the development of the third National Climate Assessment Report. This series provides regionally specific information on historical climate trends and scenarios of future climate change. Our second presenter is Representative Don Arms from the great state of Oklahoma. He first joined the House of Representatives in 2002. Representative Arms assumed his first chairmanship in 2004 as chair of the Environment Committee, giving him a unique perspective on state water issues. He later went on to chair the Agricultural Committee, dealing with many policy issues where agriculture and rural Oklahoma were concerned. He served his final 4 years as chair of the Natural Resources A and B Subcommittee on Appropriations and has been tapped by 6 consecutive speakers of the House to serve as a presiding officer, utilizing his unique skill set and his ability to communicate effectively. Our final speaker is from right here in Georgia. Chris Hamilton is the Water Reclamation Department Manager for Georgia's Clayton County Water Authority. The Clayton County Water Authority utilizes natural treatment systems to complete the purification of reclaimed water. They are one of the few metropolitan water utilities in the country utilizing constructed treatment wetlands as a final treatment stage of water reclamation. Mr. Hamilton was named Water Reclamation Manager in March of 2014, bringing 28 years of experience in the department with him. As the department manager, he oversees 51 employees at 3 treatment plants. Each of our presenters will speak for approximately 15 minutes. Please feel free to submit your questions as they come up throughout the program, and we'll try to answer as many as we are able at the end. If time does not allow us to answer all questions, please email your questions to me, and I am sure our presenters would be happy to provide an answer. And without further ado, Dr. Kunkel, you have the floor.
Thank you. I'm going to wait till my slides show up here. Okay, there they are. Okay, if you just move to the next one. I'm going to talk about the potential future climate of the southern states, and I'm going to structure my comments around the recently released third National Climate Assessment, which came out in early May. In particular, I'm going to talk about 2 things. One, about observed trends and some key climate variables, and also future projections based on some plausible scenarios of what may happen in the future with regard to greenhouse gas concentrations. Next slide. Okay, so this is the front cover of the third National Climate Assessment if you haven't seen it. Let's go to the next one. The context for the National Climate Assessment is kind of laid out here. Because of human activities, certain gases in the atmosphere are increasing in concentration, the most important being carbon dioxide, which has been going up since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and is now perhaps 30% higher than pre-industrial concentrations. Other gases are also going up that are greenhouse gases. This includes methane and nitrous oxide. If you go to the next slide, what's been happening in terms of observations globally is shown here. This is global temperature over the last 13 or 14 decades, going back into the late 19th century. And what it shows is that particularly over the last 3 decades, there's been substantial warming globally, such that every decade's been warmer than the previous one over the last 4 decades. And the last decade, or the first decade of the 21st century, is by far the warmest in the instrumental record that we have globally. Next slide. So now, let me talk about the National Climate Assessment. I'm going to kind of organize my remarks a little bit around the way the assessment is organized, and that's around some important findings that the report has written about. And this is report finding number 1, which is that global climate is changing. And in the U.S., there's a lot of evidence for changes in the U.S. climate. The global warming of the past 50 years is primarily due to human activities, in particular the burning of fossil fuels. Next slide. This graph, or this figure, shows a picture of temperature changes in the U.S. And this map shows the temperature of the last roughly 20 years, the last 2 decades, relative to the early and middle part of the 20th century. And red colors, as you might expect, are warmer conditions, and blue would be cooler. This map shows that generally over the U.S. there's been warming. And if you look at the little bar chart on the lower left-hand part of the figure, you see that over the last 3 decades, much like what's been happening globally, it's been stair-stepping its way upward, and the last decade, the most recent decade, is the warmest in the historical record. Now, if you look at the southern states, the region of interest for your group, you notice that it's actually a mixed picture in this region, where much of the region has warmed, but there are pockets where it's actually cooled a little bit, although in the last decade it's also warmed in those areas too. But this just shows that there are regional variations that are probably just due to kind of natural fluctuations in the climate that occur all the time, and the global warming is superimposed on those natural fluctuations. Next slide. What about rainfall or precipitation? This shows a map of the U.S., same kind of map showing changes over the last 2 decades relative to the early middle part of the 20th century. And here the picture is a little different in that there are some regional variations. It's not one signal that's going on. Northern and northeastern parts of the country have been becoming wetter. Parts of the west have been becoming considerably drier, particularly the southwest, while if you look at the region of the SLC, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some areas like eastern Texas have become wetter. Parts of the far southeast have become drier. So it's really kind of a mixed picture in terms of rainfall. And when we look at future projections, we'll see that same story. Next slide. Okay, what about extreme weather? Well, certain kinds of extreme weather have increased in recent decades, and we do have evidence that some of this is caused by human activities. This picture here shows a particularly brutal event, the 2011 drought and heat wave that really hit Oklahoma and Texas hard, having some of the, in fact, warmest temperatures on record in that particular region. Next slide. One of the climate features that has been increasing quite dramatically is heavy rain. This shows a bar graph. This is for the whole U.S. now, and it's the number of heavy rainfall events. I won't get into the specific definition of that, and it really doesn't matter too much. And what it shows is that these have been increasing over the last several decades. And the last decade, first decade of the 21st century, the instrumental record indicates that over the U.S. we've seen the greatest number of those events in the instrumental record. Next slide. If we look at the distribution of that, we see first of all that this is the change in heavy events, and you see all these numbers are positive except for Hawaii. The largest changes have been occurring in the eastern U.S., and this includes the southeast. The largest number has been in the northeast, but large increases in the southeast, also increases in the southern plains. Next slide, please. And if we actually look at the southeast and we look at kind of the same graph I showed before for the nation, but now I'm showing it just for the southeast, you see that the number of heavy rain storms, and this happens to be 5-year storms, has also been increasing. And as with the whole U.S., the most recent decade has seen the largest number of those in the historical record. Next slide. Okay, what about the future? Well, because of our knowledge about greenhouse gases and how they affect the climate system, we do expect that climate change will continue due to the expected increases in emissions of greenhouse gases. Next slide. So what are the possible changes that might occur? What I'm showing here are temperature changes by the end of the 21st century, by the end of this century, for 2 different pathways that we've used in the assessment. One is a lower emissions pathway, another is a higher emissions. In either one, the warming is actually quite large. In the lower emissions pathway for the southeast and southern states, we're seeing changes of 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit, while under a higher emissions scenario, we're seeing potential increases of around 5 to 7 in the southeast. Now, to put this in perspective, what we've seen globally, or what we've seen over the nation over the last century, has been a change of about 1.5 degrees or so. So we're, even under a lower emission scenario, we're talking about considerably larger changes than what we've seen already historically. Next slide. What about precipitation? I have 2 figures here just to indicate what our climate models are simulating for changes. And this shows changes in winter precipitation. The teal colors indicate increases in the future, and again, this is for the end of this century. The brownish colors are decreases. You see a pattern here that's actually part of a global pattern in which the subtropical latitudes are simulated as getting drier, and these are regions where the great deserts are located. So essentially the simulations indicate that dry areas will become drier in the future, and northern latitudes will become wetter, more precipitation. In between, there's a transition zone of little change, or we're not quite sure about what the direction will be. And the area, the southern part of the U.S. is actually in this region for the most part, except for southwest Texas, of either no change or we're not sure what the change might be. Now, if we go to the spring picture, which is the next figure, we see the same pattern, only shifted a little bit further north. And now here, for the southeast, this area of drying is actually moving northward and covering the southern part of the region. Now, if we look at annual, I'm not going to show that, but if we just look at overall annual precipitation for the southern states, for the region of the SLC, what we're seeing really is a picture of much of the region, perhaps little change in precipitation because it is in this transition zone, except for western parts, which the models simulate as drying out some as part of this, again, this global pattern of drying in the drier regions. Next slide. What about rainfall? What about heavy rainfall, rather? I just talked about rainfall. Heavy rainfall, it's actually a different story. The models are simulating increases in the most extreme rainfall almost everywhere globally and everywhere in the U.S. And this graph, or this map, shows that. It shows the change in the number of heavy rainfall days defined as rainfall more than 3 inches. And you see that the whole country, except for isolated spots in the west, are showing increases. That is, they have this teal or bluish color. And some of the largest increases are actually in the southern part of the U.S. Next slide. This is another indicator of extreme rainfall. And here I'm looking at kind of a 30-year storm, the most rainfall that might occur in a 30-year period, and how that might change in the future. And I just wanted to show this one graphic of the whole globe. And what I want you to see here is the change throughout the globe, almost everywhere, is upward. And so the South, of course, the U.S. is embedded in that, and we see increases throughout the U.S. in this kind of largest rainfall amount that you might get in a 30-year period. And it has to do with the relationship between increases in temperature and how that relates directly to increases in the amount of water that's in the atmosphere. And there's a direct relationship there. The warmer the air is, the more water vapor it can hold. And what that does, at least in our climate models, is that there is more potential for heavy rain. When you get a situation, a weather situation that would cause heavy rain, you have more fuel to work with, and the systems produce more rainfall in the models. Next slide. Okay, what about sea level? I want to talk about that. Sea level has been gradually rising throughout the 20th century, and that rise has been accelerating in the last couple decades. If we project out, next slide, what might happen in the future, in the National Climate Assessment, we've had experts evaluate the potential scenarios. And they've come up with this scenario of a 1 to 4 feet rise compared to today's level over the rest of the 21st century. And this is due to 2 factors. One, we've seen melting from the large ice masses on the, particularly Greenland and Antarctica. We expect that to continue and perhaps accelerate as warming continues. And also, as the oceans become warmer, seawater expands, and that will contribute also to this sea level rise. Next slide. Okay, what about water supply? I have showing here 2 graphs showing projected changes in water withdrawal without climate change and with climate change. And if you look at the southeast, there is a projection of increased water withdrawals even without climate change, and that's primarily due to population increases. But with climate change, the water withdrawal becomes higher, and that's mainly due to the fact that as temperatures rise, evaporation rises, and there's a need for more irrigation or more lawn watering to maintain growth. Next slide. I think I have just a couple more. Projected trends in water availability in the southeast. This is expected to decline in large part because of increases in evaporation. Next slide. And finally, vulnerability to sea level rise. Much of the coastline of the southeast is vulnerable because it is fairly low. You don't have large gradients and elevation away from the coast, and these areas become very vulnerable. Next slide. So I just want to say one word about impacts, and then I'll be done here. If global warming continues, we can expect to have both positive and negative impacts, winners and losers. However, because ecosystems have evolved and human systems have adapted to the present climate, overall we think that the net impacts are likely to be negative because of this adaptation to the past climate. And finally, I have one more slide here, and I just want to talk a little bit about our confidence in the future. Climate scientists have quite high confidence in continued warming and in other climate changes that are directly related to temperatures, such as increases in heat waves, decreases in cold waves, and increases in extreme rainfall. We have medium confidence in increased drought in most areas because of increased evaporation and in the increased intensity of strong hurricanes. And finally, we do have quite a bit of uncertainty yet about changes in severe thunderstorm phenomena, such as hailstorms and tornadoes. Next slide. I just show here the link to the National Climate Assessment. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kunkel, for those enlightening remarks. Representative Arms, you now have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. I enjoyed Dr. Kunkel's presentation very much. I want to show you a little bit of the reality of what he's talking about. We live in Oklahoma in the southwest corner. For those of you familiar with Oklahoma, we are actually near the Lawton or Fort Sill, which is the Army post there, that area. And so southwest Oklahoma is what I like to call the epicenter of the drought. Pardon me. And so what I've decided to show you today is not really fancy, it's not really in depth, and it's not really scientific, but it's a reality and it's a picture of what we are dealing with currently in southwest Oklahoma. And most of the state has kind of improved, but our southwest corner is probably the arid region. In fact, you can go from Tulsa with the average rainfall of 43.73 inches per year, and you can draw a diagonal line southwest down to the Lawton area, and the average is 31.18 inches of rain a year. So you can see a great difference, and it actually gets even worse as you go farther southwest. And that's typically, I mean, we know we're the dry part of the state. But I want to show you, the first slide I've showed you here is a flood control structure on a friend of mine's ranch, and it's actually a lake that we call Kinder Lake that's named after the family that started that farm. And if you go to the next slide, please. That's the lake, and you can see the Wichita Mountains in the background. This is southwest of Lawton, Oklahoma, about, I'm going to say 15 miles roughly southwest of Lawton. That's the Wichita Mountains in the background. You see the kids playing in the water. That lake, I don't know exactly how many acres that is, but it's a big lake. We would have usually a boat or two and a lot of watercraft and kids. You can go to the next slide if you would, please. Just another shot, and if you want to move on, there's young kids there, and you can see the dock in the background. Another shot of the boat ramp that a friend of mine made years ago where they could put boats in that water. You could ski on that lake. Again, a privately owned flood control lake. Next slide. There's just a group of cattlemen, you know, and families sitting around. That's probably a 4th of July in 2009. Now, the year is important here because it's going to look worse when you go. So next slide, please. There's just another picture of the dock that you're going to see in just a minute, and a little grandson of a friend of mine jumping off that dock, probably the first time he's jumped off anything that high. You can see the boats tied to the dock beyond the young lady. Next slide. That's that lake today. That's that lake actually a year ago. That lake dried completely in about 2010, and that lake has not been able to be used for anything, whether irrigation or recreation or anything. There has not been any water in that lake in about 4 years. So next slide. You can see the dock that we were sitting on and the young man was jumping off of, same dock. Next slide. There's that dock today. The problem with that lake is that the rancher that owns that property grazes cattle on that property, and when it rains, it just puts enough in the bottom of that lake to make it muddy, and you end up getting cattle stuck in it. So he's actually got that lake fenced off at this point to keep cattle out of the bottom of it. So when we do get a half-inch of rain or an inch of rain, which we've been getting some of those, then it doesn't, you don't have to get out there and try to rescue cattle that get bogged down in the mud. Next slide, please. That's the flood control valve that allows the lowering and raising, or lowering or trapping of water, impounding of water in that particular lake. You can see the boat ramp there growing up in weeds. It's obvious that we haven't had a 4th of July celebration or anything else out there in several years. That's taken in 2013 in September. Next slide, please. Again, there's the guys. There's an arrow pointing to the same valve that you saw in the picture before. And you can see the difference in how much water has evaporated in that lake. So next slide, please. And there's the contrast. There's the dock with the young man and his sister where they're playing in the water, and then to the right in 2013, and it's still that way today, there's the dock. So what we're dealing with in southwest Oklahoma is an ongoing drought. We've had a tremendously long drought. In fact, our Conservation Commission folks have said to us that this is the worst drought since the Dust Bowl. The only difference is our ag practices are better. We don't leave soil open. We leave cover crops. For instance, in Oklahoma, we grow a lot of cotton, and you'll see a lot of cotton planted right into wheat stubble just to hold the soil. It just keeps that soil from blowing away. So we've been dealing with that ongoing drought here for a long time. I'll give you some lake levels in the southwest Oklahoma region. And again, I don't really know a lot about outside my region other than what I hear, but we have several Corps of Engineer lakes. One is Lake Tom Steed. It's west of Lawton a good bit. It's at 27% capacity right now. It's a water supply, I believe, for Altus and Frederick, Oklahoma, and several municipalities. Waurika Lake, which is a Corps lake southeast of Lawton, it's at 36%, and it provides water for several communities. Probably the most dire situation in southwest Oklahoma currently is Altus, Oklahoma, which, if anybody's familiar with the Air Force, there's an Air Force base at Altus. Altus Lugert, which is actually an irrigation lake. It was built in the 40s with the sole purpose of irrigating cotton. That's quite a cotton region there, and that lake is at 11.7% right now, and that lake by the Oklahoma Wildlife Department has been declared dead. What that means is they go out and try to shock fish and get a count on how many viable fish are in that lake, and they have declared that lake a total loss, and they have had absolutely no measurable rainfall, or no runoff, let's say that. We get a little rain out here and we kind of spoon feed the grass, and it looks a little better for a day or two, and then the heat comes back and the hot wind, and we are back to evaporation. So it's really been interesting trying to learn how to manage this drought for those of us in the livestock and farming business in southwest Oklahoma, and not only southwest Oklahoma, but North Texas, West Texas, all those areas that surround us. The irrigation guys, the guys that make their living irrigating cotton or other crops, have kind of done a lot of innovative things that really aren't as they say, rocket science. They rather than just having a big pivot sprinkler going and spraying water, they drop those nozzles down close to the crop where that does negate or decrease, I should say, some of that water loss and that evaporation as that water atomizes. Also, a lot of the guys are using drip systems, which means kind of like putting drip pipe in the ground. They're also doing some chemigation with that. There's one cotton producer over in Jackson County in southwest Oklahoma who is who has built a small lake to try to capture a little bit of water to where he can keep his cotton business going. And also they're drilling wells. One of the problems they have with groundwater in this region is there's a lot of gyp and salt and things like that, so it's really tough water. It's not very good water. You can't spray it on top of a plant or you'll burn it. You have to run it down the rows. So those are one of the things that they're trying to do. The irrigation folks are having to become more creative. They've got to get every drop of water that they can, because that lake that was built again back in the 40s is useless right now and has been for about the past 4 or 5 years. So one of the things that's becoming quite critical in the Altus, Oklahoma region, again, they're at Altus Air Force Base, is their municipal water is almost out. And there have been talk about municipal reuse. And a friend of mine who is with the Corps of Engineers that keeps track of these lakes in southwest Oklahoma said the one thing you have to do when you talk about municipal reuse is get past what he calls the yuck factor. And that is a pretty big hill to climb, because you have to have people's confidence that that water's pure. I think we've got the technology. I think it's one of the things that if this drought continues in our region, we must absolutely look at those things. And if we don't, we're going to have towns running out of water, and when that happens, then of course people have to move away. Military installations may not be able to function and things like that. I have a pretty glass half full mentality. I think we're going to be okay in time. One of our gentlemen that I used to work with at the Water Resources Board in Oklahoma, who has since retired, called it the hydro-illogical cycle, and he had a little cartoon that went with it. And basically, when it starts raining again, and it will at some point, then people tend to forget the discussion. So it's almost like this drought has drug on long enough that we finally got people's attention, and they're actually starting to have some of these conversations. I think the critical piece is, can we keep those discussions going, and will people's memory stay with them on these drought situations enough to continue to get more efficient in that water use? We have limited amounts of water here. We have a lot of evaporation, a lot of intense heat, and we can't waste a drop of water in this part of the world. So I know it's that way in other places too, but we tend to think we're the epicenter here, because we have been dealing with this for several years, and we don't know if we're out of the woods yet. So I don't have a whole lot more than that. I just wanted to show you a little bit of what we're dealing with in my region, and some of the issues that we're facing, and some real visuals of the real thing. So I appreciate the time, and I'll be glad to try to answer any questions later if that need arises. Thank you.
And thank you, Representative Arms, for that informative presentation on what the water situation is on the ground in Oklahoma. Mr. Hamilton, you now have the floor.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. I want to talk a little bit about how the Clayton County Water Authority has developed a sustainable water resource here in Clayton County. Let me give you a little bit of background about Clayton County Water Authority. We were created by the Georgia State Legislature back in 1955, and we are guided by a 7-member board of directors, and we operate solely on water, sewer, and stormwater revenues and no tax support. We have over 78,000 water, wastewater, and stormwater accounts. We serve over 270,000 people. We have 3 water plants, 3 water reclamation facilities, and we have enough water and sewer pipe in the ground to stretch from here to Denver, Colorado, and back. CCWA, we built our success on planning and action. We have limited water supplies here in Clayton County, and water quality issues in the Flint River in the 1970s, were drivers for our innovation. You see, Clayton County, it's located in the upper Piedmont region of the state of Georgia. The county has no large rivers or impoundments to draw water from, and we sit on the north-south ridge that divides the county right in half. And so we have a dual watershed here in Clayton County. The eastern half of the county, the water drains to our Ocmulgee River Basin. The western half of the drains to the Flint River Basin. And underneath all that is just, we just have bedrock. And so that limits our groundwater quality and quantity, and it's very variable, and so we just have a limited water supply, so we have to come up with a way to keep the water in our watershed. Clayton County is one of the smallest counties in landmass here in the state of Georgia, but it's one of the more densely populated areas. We have, like I said, approximately 270,000 residents, and we're a small county. So we have to have a sustainable water supply for our population, our communities, and so we had to do something about that. One of our objectives of our 2000 master plan was to recapture reclaimed water to ensure a dependable water supply for Clayton County and our residents. Planning for indirect potable reuse involved the following steps: appropriate water reclamation and water treatment technologies, review by independent experts, source water protection, water quality monitoring, and public relations and education. So the first step is water reclamation. We got to take that water, that used water from the community, we got to treat it to a high degree before it can be reused. And so the process starts with one of our state-of-the-art water reclamation facilities, which have all been recently upgraded and expanded. Next slide. I'm sorry. We have 3 water reclamation facilities here in Clayton County. We have the W.B. Casey Water Reclamation Facility. It has a design treatment capacity of 24 million gallons a day, and all of the flow treated at that plant, after it's treated, flows to a Huey constructed wetland site, which is what I'm going to be talking about here in a minute. We also have a Shoal Creek Water Reclamation Facility. Water from that facility is pumped over to our Panhandle Road constructed wetlands. And then we have our Northeast plant, and it actually discharges directly into Panther Creek. It does not, the flow treated at that plant does not go to a constructed wetland. All 3 of the water reclamation facilities have advanced treatment technologies. We remove nutrients at all 3 plants. Each plant also includes physical, chemical treatment, and disinfection. In the year 2000, Clayton County Water Authority was at a crossroads. We had an aging land application system. It's a spray irrigation system that we used for a little over 30 years. And that system is very labor intensive, high energy demand to pump the water out to the land application site. On top of that, the maintenance on those systems are very intensive, and we had over 25,000 sprinkler heads, many miles of distribution pipe, hundreds of valves, and severely outdated pump stations. So we knew we had to do something. We did not know if we wanted to rebuild the land application system, but we felt like there was something else out there that we could do. So after an exhaustive search for a less consumptive wastewater treatment method, we decided to go with the constructed wetland. Next slide, please. So new constructed wetlands receive treated effluent flow from that W.B. Casey and Shoal Creek water reclamation facilities. And between both of those constructed wetlands, we've got a treatment capacity of 21.8 million gallons a day of water. Next slide. This is an aerial photo of our E.L. Huey constructed wetlands. It has a treatment capacity of 17.4 million gallons a day, and the effluent flow from that facility flows to our Blaylock and Shamrock drinking water reservoirs. Next slide. And this is a aerial photo of our Panhandle Road constructed wetlands. The Panhandle Road constructed wetlands has a treatment capacity of 4.4 million gallons a day, and the effluent flow from the wetlands is pumped to our Shoal Creek raw water reservoir. Next slide. So what is a wetland? Constructed wetland treatment is a process involving plants, soils, microbes that occur naturally in the soil and in the aquatic ecosystem, all playing a part of removing excess nutrients and pollutants that's not removed in our water reclamation facilities. Next slide. The constructed wetlands, they give us increased treatment capacity, efficient water recharge of the drinking water reservoirs. We have lower maintenance costs and operational costs than we did with the land application system that we once used. We do get recreational and educational benefits of that. And it continues a tradition of natural treatment here at the Clayton County Water Authority, which, like I said, we've been doing this land application or constructed wetland for over 30 years now. Next slide, I'm sorry. Also, constructed wetlands, you can expect them to remove an additional 10 to 20% more conventional pollutants after you do the treatment at the water reclamation facilities. Next slide. So here in Clayton County, we're returning highly treated wastewater, or we call it reclaimed water, back into our drinking water supplies. And it's been a big benefit. It's kept us out of bad situations during drought conditions. Back in 2007, some of you may remember, we had a pretty rough drought here in Clayton County and in the state of Georgia. At the worst time during that drought period, our drinking water capacity that we had on hand dropped to 77%. We equated that out to at least 200 days of supply without additional rainfall. While others around us in the metropolitan area were really struggling. There were some that, they thought they were going to, run out of water. And so we were in a good situation. We were actually in the position where we still wanted to sell more water, but we couldn't do that because we wanted to make sure we complied with the rules set forth by the Environmental Protection Division as far as water rules, and so we did not do that. But yeah, we were in really good shape during the 2007 drought. Next slide, please. So after the water goes through the water reclamation facilities, you have advanced treatment at those facilities to remove nutrients, other pollutants. Then the water flows through these constructed wetlands that we've built. The water leaving those constructed wetlands is pristine. It looks really, really good. It meets, really all the standards set forth by EPD. And that water then flows into the drinking water reservoirs. And that's where we end the process as far as water reclamation. But then that water is pulled out of those reservoirs and it's pumped to the water production plants. Now, at the water production plants, they utilize that surface water as their water source. All of these water plants, they employ conventional treatment processes, including multiple barrier approach for pathogen control by utilizing advanced ultraviolet disinfection processes in combination with traditional chlorine disinfection. So that's an extra protection for our customers to give them a little bit of relief to know that this indirect reuse system that we have here in Clayton County is safe, and you don't have to worry about it. We're taking care of business, making sure we're putting out really good water to our customers. Next slide, please. An added benefit for having these constructed wetlands here in Clayton County is positive press coverage. We've been recognized in local newspapers for sustainability during drought conditions. Next slide. We've also showed up in an AWWA trade publication for innovation for indirect potable reuse. We've also been recognized in many other trade magazines for the same thing. So we get positive press for having these constructed wetlands and this indirect reuse system that we use here in the Clayton County Water Authority. Next slide. We've also showed up in the United States National Climate Assessment Report for innovation as well for our constructed wetland treatment and recharge groundwater and surface reservoirs. So we'll move to the last slide. The Clayton County Water Authority, we look forward to a bright future provided by our current roadmap and master planning efforts. That future will always include having our eyes and our vision set on quality water and quality service. And that's my presentation. If anybody has any questions, I'll be glad to entertain those.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton, for that interesting presentation. We received several questions during the webinar, and the first one goes to Dr. Kunkel. Dr. Kunkel, given the data laid out in your presentation, what steps can reasonably be taken to remediate current and projected water shortages?
Well, not sure I'm the right one to answer that question. I mean, in terms of the climate changes that could occur in the future, I think there's, two paths forward. Probably both are necessary in order to address this issue. One is realizing that these changes, some of these changes we're pretty confident in those changes, and so adapting now to these potential future changes is, I think, a very cost-effective and wise approach. Secondly, I think on that if we were to continue to increase our emissions at the current rate, and every year we're putting out more than the previous year, at some point in time the climate changes really become severe and very difficult to deal with. And so long-term efforts to reduce emissions are also, I think, an important part of that.
Thank you, Dr. Kunkel. The next question we received is for Representative Arms. Representative Arms, in your presentation you mentioned that the severity and the duration of the current drought being experienced by Oklahoma has finally spurred a conversation about what can be done to conserve water. How do you, as a legislator, keep this discussion going?
Well, I think that we have to continue to keep it on the radar screen of the citizens. I mean, obviously, when you're in a situation like some of our municipalities are, where they are really concerned about, the use. I mean, household water. I mean, watering your lawn is one thing. You can capture water in a rain barrel and take care of your plants on your patio. But when it comes down to can you get water from your tap to cook and to take baths and things like that, you're going to stay in that discussion. And I think these municipalities who continue to be afraid of running out of water, I think that's that's the low-hanging fruit. That is the group that's going to be in the discussion. Where you tend to lose people is as we move east in the state of Oklahoma and we get into wetter areas, rain continues to fall, and those people all of a sudden don't see a problem. Oh, we're no longer rationing water, so it must be okay, and then move on with their lives. And I think it's a matter of keeping our citizens engaged. And I'm not sure the answer to that, actually, except that I think we just have to try. I think we have to continue to become more efficient and continue to make those strides. And I think the legislature just has to keep that on the front burner as much as they can, because we'll have another drought. We may come out of this cycle, and we know we will at some point, and it'll cycle back around, but we'll see it again. And I think the key is to prepare for the next one. We're in this one. We're here. We're dealing with it the best we can, but I think we must get ready for the next one. And I think that's where we have to keep these discussions going.
Thank you, Representative Arms. Mr. Hamilton, What advice do you have for other states who may be interested in implementing constructed wetlands treatment processes? And what resources do they need to have in place to make a project like this a reality?
Well, you have to have a master plan. You got to plan for the future. You got to have the resources that you're going to need to build a sustainable water supply. You got to have the support from the community, your board of directors, management, and the staff who might operate the facilities, like we have the constructed wetlands here at Clayton County Water Authority. And I just think that if you do the right planning and set aside the money, that you can build a sustainable water supply. It doesn't necessarily have to be constructed wetlands, but you got to make the plan ahead of time, well in advance. We're always doing master planning. I'm sure most people do that. So we're looking out every 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. What are we going to need to do? We're looking at population growth and that sort of thing. But we've had some managers with real vision here in Clayton County who saw years ago that we were going to need to do something to maintain an adequate water supply, because here in Clayton County we're limited on our surface water supplies, and we want to try to keep that in the watershed. And so we built the land application system and the constructed wetlands, and it served us well. Like I told you in my presentation, we were really not in a bad situation during the drought conditions. I mean, yeah, our reservoirs were dropping, but we had plenty of water in storage, and we really didn't feel like we were going to run out, but because we have this indirect potable reuse system in place. So planning, that's really what I could say is plan ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Hamilton. We're running out of time and need to wrap up the webinar, but for any of you who have remaining questions, please forward those questions to me and I'll work on getting you a response from the presenters. I want to thank our speakers today for their contributions, and I'd also like to thank my CSG colleague, Carrie Abner, for her help with all of the technical aspects today. Thanks to all of you for spending an hour of your afternoon with us. I hope you found this webinar useful and informative. If there is anything more that CSG or SLC can do for you in your work, please don't hesitate to contact us. Thanks again, and have a wonderful afternoon.